She wore gigantic wigs, threw epic parties, and supposedly told starving peasants to eat cake. But spoiler alert, she probably didn't say that, but it definitely didn't stop the gossip. Hi guys, and thanks for joining. Tonight we dive into the story of Marie Antoinette, who wasn't just a queen, she was 18th century France's favorite gossip column subject. From wild spending sprees to political scandals, secret affairs to fashion crimes, she managed to cause controversy just by existing. But before we begin, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Find your comfy place, and let's get started. So how did a teenage Austrian princess end up as the face of royal excess and the ultimate PR disaster for the French monarchy? Let's dig into the drama, the myths, and the messy truth behind Marie Antoinette. Before she was the Queen of France, she was Maria Antonia Josepha Joanna. Wow, that's a mouthful. She was born in 1755 as the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Yes, 15th. Maria Antonia was part of the ultimate royal sibling squad. Her mom, Empress Maria, had one major strategy: marry her kids into every royal family in Europe. Love? Compatibility? Personality? Nope. It was all about treaties, alliances, and making sure the Habsburgs stayed booked and busy. Young Marie wasn't exactly what you'd call studious. She was more into music, dancing, and not doing her French homework. By the time she was chosen to marry the future King of France, she could play the harp beautifully, but couldn't write a grammatically correct sentence in French. Awkward, considering she was about to live there. Enter Louis Auguste, shy, awkward, and more interested in locks and key making than romance. He was the future King Louis XVI, and he had the charisma of a damp baguette. But hey, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons needed an alliance. So, guess who's getting married? That's right. At the ripe old age of 14, Marie Antoinette was shipped off to France to become queen someday, whether she liked it or not. Now here's where things get really weird. At the border between Austria and France, Marie had to go through what's basically the royal version of international customs. Except, instead of declaring fruit, she had to give up everything Austrian. Clothes? Gone. Jewelry? Gone. Childhood pug? Ripped from her arms. I'm not even joking. They took her dog. They took her pug. The message was clear. You're French now, sweetie. They even built a fancy little house, a ceremonial pavilion, just for the handoff. It was like a political drive-through. One teenage bride to go, hold the identity. Soon after, she met her new husband and had a very awkward wedding ceremony. She was Marie Antoinette, now the future queen, foreign outsider, and the newest attraction at the Palace of Versailles. What could possibly go wrong? But hold on, let's rewind a second and talk about their super awkward wedding. The day is May 16th, 1770, the big day. The royal wedding of Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste was the event of a decade. Versailles was packed. The people were excited, and France was ready to celebrate their new teenage power couple. Let's recap the situation. Marie was 14. Louis, he was only 15. They'd only just met. Neither of them really knew what they were doing. And suddenly, they were the center of a European media frenzy in a world with no Instagram fillers to save them. The wedding took place in the Palace of Versailles, in the royal chapel, and everything was enormous. The dress? So big, it reportedly needed help to fit through doorways. The guest list? Hundreds of nobles, all silently judging. The pressure? Immeasurable. It was so crowded that many nobles couldn't even see the ceremony. which for some was probably a blessing, because honestly, it was a little awkward. For starters, the ring didn't fit at all, like at all. Some say it had to be forced onto her finger. Others say it was just a minor fumble. Either way, wasn't exactly a romantic moment. Then came the royal bedding ceremony. Yes, that was actually a thing. After the wedding, the newlyweds were paraded into their bedroom. Yes, with a full audience of nobles, to be tucked into bed together like toddlers, except everyone was secretly hoping that they'd make a royal baby. But did they? No. Well, not that night. Actually, not for 7 years. But more on that later. The court was already buzzing with gossip. Marie Antoinette, she was, well, too Austrian. Louis, he was just too quiet. And the marriage, while politically important, was already being treated like a royal reality show, complete with drama, speculation, and an unhealthy obsession with what happened behind closed doors. So Marie Antoinette, she's now the Dauphine of France, basically the queen in waiting, and she's living in Versailles, the most extravagant and most judgmental place on earth. If you thought your high school had drama, Versailles, it's telling you to hold her powdered wig. Marie was still a teenager, thousands and thousands of miles from home, and suddenly expected to navigate one of the most rigid, snobby, etiquette-obsessed courts in Europe. She didn't speak perfect French. She didn't follow every court ritual. And worst of all, she didn't get pregnant right away. That alone turned her into a full-blown scandal magnet. The royal couple's bedroom issues were soon the talk of Europe. For 7 years, Louis and Marie didn't consummate their marriage. Yep, 7 whole years. That's 2 presidential terms of awkward silences. People were so obsessed with their lack of intimacy that foreign ambassadors were writing home about it. Theories flew. Was Louis uninterested? Was Marie too cold? Was it a medical issue? Did they not just know how to do it? Well, spoiler alert, it was probably the last one. Meanwhile, the press, yes, there was a kind of 18th century gossip media, had a field day. Pamphlets portrayed Marie Antoinette as vain, frivolous, and worse, unfaithful. They gave her terrible nicknames. Classy, right? To escape the pressure, Marie Antoinette threw herself into fashion and fun. She went hard on shopping sprees. Think massive gowns, towering wigs with entire scenes built into them, ships, birds, and gardens. Marie Antoinette's fashion obsession and shopping sprees are legendary, and they weren't just about vanity. They had real political consequences. She became a trendsetter, a tabloid target, and the original scapegoat for reckless spending, even though she wasn't the only one draining the treasury. If Marie Antoinette had an Instagram account, it would have been outfit of the day posts, shopping hauls, and get ready with me to ruin a monarchy video. Because when it came to fashion, Marie didn't just follow trends, she made them. She was the ultimate 18th century influencer. Nobles, courtiers, and wannabe aristocrats across Europe copied her style, like their lives depended on it. And Versailles? It sort of did. Her go-to designer, Rose Burton, known as the Minister of Fashion. She dressed Marie in towering wigs, embroidered gowns, and accessories that made the Met Gala look like a thrift store. We're talking about outfits that cost tens of thousands of livres. Well, that was the currency at the time. And that was per dress. Adjusted for today's money, easily hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, just on clothing. Some estimates say she spent the modern day equivalent of $3 to $5 million annually on fashion and beauty alone. She had a new dress for nearly every day, and wigs so tall they needed reinforcement with themes. There was the ship wig to celebrate a naval victory, a wig with a mini garden in it, and even one inspired by hot air balloons. Practical? No. Iconic? Absolutely. But here's where it all stopped being fabulous and started being, well, controversial. While Marie played royal dress-up, France's economy, it was falling apart. Bread prices were rising, and the country was deep in debt. And regular people, well, they were barely surviving. So when the public saw the queen dropping royal coin on feathers and diamonds while they were skipping meals, they kind of lost it. Newspapers and pamphlets turned her into a fashion-obsessed villain. One famous insult, they started calling her Madame Deficit, blaming her for the country's financial collapse. Which is wild because, spoiler alert, France was already broke when she showed up. And the truth? Her spending was a fraction of France's total debt, most of which came from funding wars, like the American Revolution. But Marie, she was visible, foreign, and fabulously overdressed, which made her the perfect scapegoat. Ironically, when she did try and tone it down, like wearing plain cotton dresses in her private retreat, the Petite Trianon, she was slammed again. Critics said she was mocking the working class by pretending to be a peasant princess. She literally couldn't win. So whether she was wearing diamonds or muslin, ball gowns or bonnets, Marie Antoinette's fashion choices were always under fire. And as France's tensions escalated, what she wore became just as political as what she said. She also started spending lots of time with a close-knit group of friends at her private retreat, where she could ditch court formally and pretend to be a carefree country girl. She even dressed up like a shepherdess, in silk, obviously, and played pretend farm life at her custom-built village. Meanwhile, real French peasants were, starving, so this didn't exactly go over really well. It all added up, her spending, her fashion, her country cosplay, and the growing suspicion that she was more interested in parties than politics made her a prime target for scandal. And with no baby to show for her marriage, her popularity at court, and with the public, well, it started to tank. Soon the country's financial problems would worsen, the press would get nastier, and the scandals would become far more damaging than just a badly timed shopping spree. But here's what the public didn't understand about Marie. So, we know Marie Antoinette, we know she loved to shop, right? But why? Was it just royal ego? Was she the 18th century version of a real housewife with unlimited credit? Or was it something deeper? Let's be real. Versailles was not a fun place for a teenage girl, even if it looked like a fairy tale from the outside. Marie was dropped into one of the most rigid, gossipy, and backstabbing environments in Europe, all while she was still basically a child. She didn't choose her husband, she didn't speak the language fluently, and she had zero privacy. Her mornings began with strangers watching her get dressed. Yeah, that was an actual court ritual. Oh, and add to that the tiny detail that she couldn't produce an heir for the first 7 years of her marriage, which in royal terms was basically the one thing that she had to do. The pressure, well, it was enormous. So what exactly did she have control over? Her wardrobe, her hair, her inner circle, her little fantasy world at Petite Trianon. Shopping became sort of like an escape, a way to feel powerful, beautiful, and maybe even normal. Today we'd call it retail therapy. Back then, it was a form of rebellion and survival. Just think about it. You're trapped in a gilded cage. You're lonely. Your every move is criticized. Your marriage, well, it's a little awkward. You're not producing an heir, and everyone already hates you for being foreign. So you distract yourself the only way you can, with silk, shoes, and scandalous hats the size of furniture. Was it a cry for help? Maybe not consciously, but it was definitely a way to assert her identity in a world where she was treated more like a diplomatic pawn than a person. Unfortunately, what started as coping turned into controversy. The more she spent, the more people hated her. The more they hated her, the more she escaped into fashion. It became a cycle, and it wouldn't be long before it all exploded. So while Marie Antoinette was spending jaw-dropping amounts of money on gowns and jewels, she was also looking for something a little harder to buy: peace. And that's where the Petit Trianon comes in. Tucked away in the far reaches of the Versailles grounds, the Petit Trianon was originally built for the mistress of Louis XV. But in 1774, Louis XVI gave it to Marie Antoinette as a private gift, basically saying, "Here, have your own escape pod." And she took full advantage. At Versailles, she was watched, criticized, and smothered by ceremony. But at Petit Trianon, she made the rules. No court etiquette, no permission needed, no snooty nobles correcting her posture every 5 minutes. She dressed simply, sometimes in soft cotton muslin gowns that looked more like nightgowns than royal fashion. She hosted small dinners with friends, strolled through English-style gardens, and even built a mock village nearby, complete with fake cottages, goats, and a dairy house. Some saw it as charming. Others thought it was insane. One noble called it playing peasant with porcelain buckets. In the press? Oh, they loved it. They called her delusional, spoiled, and out of touch. The queen, pretending to live like a commoner, while the real peasants couldn't even afford bread. And spoiler, the "let them eat cake" quote? Yeah, she never said that. But this kind of behavior, it made that stick. For Marie, the Petit Trianon was a sanctuary, a world where she could finally just breathe. But for the French public, it became a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy: excess, ignorance, and escape. It's easy to look at Marie Antoinette through the lens of luxury, the dresses, the diamonds, the endless parties, and say, wow, how out of touch. And sure, from the countryside, it looked like she was living in a royal daydream. But behind all that silk and satin was a teenage girl, far from home, under intense pressure, and slowly crumbling under the weight of expectation and isolation. She arrived in France at 14, surrounded by strangers, unable to speak the language fluently, and married to a boy who didn't even know how to talk to her, let alone touch her. For years, she was publicly judged for not producing an heir. That wasn't just gossip, it was national concern. Imagine your reproductive health being international news at 15. She was mocked in pamphlets, ridiculed for her looks, accused of affairs, none of which had any evidence, and yet the public ate it up. Why? Because they needed a villain, and she was foreign, fashionable, and extremely visible. Her retreat to the Petit Trianon, that wasn't a political statement. That was self-preservation, a mental break, a place where she could finally let down the walls, even for just a moment. And still, they called her selfish, pretending to be a peasant while the real one suffered, but no one asked what she was suffering from. Was she spoiled? Absolutely. Was she naive? For sure. But she was also overwhelmed, underprepared, and totally unsupported. Even her mother criticized her from afar, sending cold letters full of warnings and disappointment. No therapist, no privacy, no support system, just layers of silk and layers of expectations she never asked for. In today's terms, Marie Antoinette was dealing with a massive mental health crisis, in public, in real time, and the entire country blaming her for their misery. And no one stopped to ask what all that pressure was doing to her. By the mid-1780s, Marie Antoinette's image was hanging by a thread. The public saw her as cold, vain, reckless, a foreign queen with expensive tastes and no concern for their suffering. But what came next? It would destroy her reputation completely. It was called the Affair of the Diamond Necklace, and it had everything: greed, deception, forged letters, stolen jewels, a rogue cardinal, and a fake Marie Antoinette. It sounds like fiction, but for the queen, it was a living nightmare. It began with Cardinal de Rohan, a high-ranking noble who desperately wanted to win back the queen's favor. Enter Jean de la Motte, a con artist posing as royalty, who told the cardinal she could secretly arrange a meeting with the queen for a price. She even forged letters, supposedly from Marie Antoinette, full of flattery and requests for help. The cardinal, he believed every word of it. Then came the most unbelievable part. One night, in the gardens of Versailles, the cardinal met with a woman he believed was the queen. In reality, it was a prostitute dressed like Marie Antoinette, coached to say just a few flattering words. And that was all it took. And then came the necklace, an outrageous piece of jewelry, originally designed for King Louis XV's mistress, worth 1.6 million livres. That's roughly $15 million today. The cardinal, he agreed to buy it in the queen's name, believing she had secretly asked him to. But Marie Antoinette, she had no idea. None. She never asked for the necklace. She never met the cardinal. She was being impersonated in a scam that she didn't even know existed. When the fraud was discovered, it exploded. The cardinal, he was arrested publicly at Versailles, and people immediately assumed it was Marie Antoinette's doing, that she had ordered the necklace in secret, that she was abusing the treasury, that she was covering something up. The truth? She was innocent, but it didn't matter. The trial was public, the cardinal was acquitted, and the queen, already hated, already doubted, was humiliated. This scandal confirmed every suspicion the people had about her, even though it was all based on a lie. She had become the villain in a story she didn't write, a story no one cared to fact-check. After the diamond necklace affair, Marie Antoinette's reputation was shattered. No speech, no dress, no smile could fix it. The Queen of France was no longer a misunderstood foreign princess. She was, in the eyes of the public, an enemy of the people. She was called vain, wasteful, self-absorbed, a foreigner who didn't care about France. But the part they never talked about? She was also a mother, and a really good one. Marie Antoinette had 4 children, and from the moment she became a mother, something shifted. The court noticed it, even her critics noticed it, and she became more gentler, more grounded, almost desperate to protect what little happiness she had left. She spent real time with her children, which for royalty was rare. Queens were supposed to have kids and then hand them off to governesses, but Marie, she wrote letters, gave hugs, braided hair, played games. She chose to be there. When her young son, Louis Joseph, died of tuberculosis, she was devastated. She wrote of feelings of loss. She was unable to sleep. She was haunted by the sound of his last breaths. But the public barely flinched. They were too busy judging her spending habits, mocking her fashion, and calling her Madame Deficit. To them, she was a symbol, not a mother. Even as she grieved, the rumors didn't stop. The criticism didn't stop. The whispers said she cared more about ribbons than the country, that she was unfit to be queen. But behind palace doors, she was tucking in her children, comforting fevers, reading bedtime stories, not plotting against France. Her youngest son, Louis Charles, he adored her. After the revolution began, she would cling to him like he was the only thing keeping her going, because maybe he was. She wasn't perfect, but she was never the monster they made her out to be. She was a mother in a gilded cage, trying to hold her family together, while the world outside demanded her head. Years of war debt, rising food prices, and deep resentment toward the aristocracy had pushed the people to the edge, and when the Estates General met in May, it was supposed to calm the tension. Instead, it lit a fuse. It started with whispers, then hunger, then rage, and by the summer of 1789, France was no longer grumbling. It was boiling. On July 14th of 1789, the people stormed Bastille, a royal prison that had come to symbolize tyranny. They tore it down brick by brick, and with that, the French Revolution had officially begun. At Versailles, the royal family was stunned. Louis didn't know what to do. Marie Antoinette, for all of her political inexperience, sensed the danger far more clearly. She knew the people hated her. Now it wasn't just insults, it was weapons, it was blood. Just 3 months later, in October, it got even worse. Thousands of women, furious over bread shortages, marched from Paris to Versailles. They wanted food, they wanted justice, and many of them wanted the queen's head. They stormed the palace. They broke into her bedchamber. The queen had barely escaped her bedchamber through a hidden door. For the first time, the revolution wasn't just outside. It was inside. She had just barely escaped. One more minute, and she might have died that night. And yet, she stepped out onto the balcony, alone, unarmed, face to face with a furious mob. They screamed. They raised their fists. And slowly, they were silent. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She stood tall. And in that moment, even her enemies were forced to pause. The next morning, the people made their demands very clear. The royal family would return to Paris under their watch. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And while Louis XVI formally agreed, make no mistake, they were being taken as prisoners dressed up as honored guests. The journey back, it was brutal. Crowds lined the streets, hurling insults. Some carried pikes with the severed head of the queen's guards. Marie Antoinette, she rode in silence, clutching her children, staring out at a country that now saw her as a villain. They were relocated to the Tuileries Palace under house arrest. A royal family in name only. Every letter censored. Every movement watched. Marie Antoinette, once a girl lost in luxury, was now a prisoner of the people. When they arrived at the palace, they were no longer monarchs, just prisoners in a crumbling world. Versailles was gone, their freedom gone, and the revolution had only just began. From the moment they arrived at the palace in October of 1789, the royal family's world grew smaller and darker. What had once been a palace fit for kings now felt more like a prison. The rooms were drafty. The food, it was plain. The corridors echoed in silence, and sometimes with shouts from the angry mob gathered just outside the gates. They were watched day and night. Letters were censored. Visitors were rare. Every move they made was reported back to the revolutionary leaders in Paris. Marie Antoinette tried to hold on to some sense of normalcy. She homeschooled her children, she read, she wrote letters to her remaining allies in Austria. She tried, with every ounce of strength, to maintain the image of a queen for her children, if no one else. But the pressure was unbearable. Her youngest son, Louis Charles, grew anxious and clingy. Her daughter was old enough to understand that something was really wrong. And Marie Antoinette, stripped of power, humiliated, and trapped, was left wondering, how did it all come to this? Sometimes they were jeered at through the windows. Crowds would gather to shout insults, chant "Death to the Austrian," a nickname they gave her, not out of accuracy, but one out of hatred. To them, she was still the villain, the foreign traitor, the careless queen who bled France dry. But behind those walls, she wasn't extravagant anymore. She was just a mother trying to stay calm for her children, a wife watching her husband lose control, a woman surrounded by enemies and shadows, waiting for the revolution to make its next move. They had once been the most powerful couple in France, but by 1790, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were just tired. Louis withdrew. He stopped making decisions. When news came from the National Assembly, he would nod, frown, sigh, but in the end, he'd do nothing. He was indecisive by nature, but now it was worse. It was like the crown had become too heavy for him to lift. So she stepped up. Marie Antoinette, once dismissed as frivolous, became the more politically active of the two. She read newspapers, decoded threats, met in secret with loyalists and foreign diplomats. The Austrian woman was now the one quietly running what little remained of the monarchy. She wrote frantic letters to her brother, Emperor Joseph II in Austria, begging for help, troops, money, anything. But most of all, she wanted one thing: a way out. Their marriage, once cold and awkward, was now strained by something heavier: fear, guilt, regret. Marie tried to protect her children. Louis had tried to be a king, and both were watching it all fall apart, one humiliating day at a time. The crowds outside, well, they grew louder. The guards, they grew bolder. The people were hungry for change, and they no longer believed in kings and queens. Marie Antoinette could feel it, like a wave coming closer, no matter how hard she tried to stand still. And so, the idea began to take shape, quietly, desperately, one chance, one night, one escape. By 1791, it was clear. The monarchy was collapsing. Every day in Paris, the royal family woke up to tighter restrictions, harsher stares, and louder calls for their heads. If they stayed, they would be swallowed by the revolution. So Marie Antoinette made a choice. They would run. The plan was ambitious. Some would say arrogant. They would flee Paris under the cover of the night, making their way northeast to Montmedy, a fortress town near the Austrian border where loyal troops were waiting. Helping them in secret? Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman, fiercely loyal to the queen, and rumored to be more than just a friend. It was Fersen who arranged the logistics, passports, horses, timing. He even helped disguise the carriage. Yes, they would travel in disguise. Louis would pose as a valet, Marie Antoinette as a governess. The children would pretend to be someone else's. It was meant to be subtle, low profile, but in true royal fashion. They chose a giant golden carriage that was slow, heavy, and impossible to miss. Instead of splitting up and traveling fast, they stuck together and drew attention at every single stop. Marie insisted the children not be separated. She wanted them safe and near her. It was a mother's decision, but a costly one. Every detail was risky. They needed forged papers, friendly guards, safe houses, timing, precision, and total secrecy. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, one missed detail, and it would all fall apart. And so on the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family slipped out of the palace, dressed in costume, surrounded by silence, chasing freedom in the dark. It began on midnight. The royal family slipped out of the palace. The streets of Paris were asleep, and for the first time in years, there was a flicker of hope. Louis XVI posing as a valet, Marie Antoinette a governess, their children, now commoners, and the giant lumbering coach that would carry them all the way to freedom. Or so they hoped. The plan? Travel over 130 miles northeast, where 10,000 loyalist troops were waiting, and they had to get there unnoticed, fast, and together. But the coach was slow, heavy, and the roads muddy, broken, and crowded with checkpoints. What should have taken hours began dragging into days. At each stop, they tried to blend in, but Louis couldn't help himself. Chatting too much, tipping too well, acting like a total royal. And guess what? People started to notice. Then, in Varennes, it happened. A local postmaster saw the king. He recognized his face from coins, and in a moment that would change history, he jumped on horseback and raced ahead to block the road. By the time the royal carriage arrived, the road was blocked. The trap was set. They begged to continue. They insisted it was all just a misunderstanding, but no one believed them. The townspeople searched their belongings, checked their papers, and when they found the Queen's signature, it was all over. The King and Queen of France had tried to abandon their people. Too many, it was treason. Proof that they had never intended to reform, only to run. The next day, they were escorted back to Paris, not as rulers, but as criminals. And this time, the crowd, they didn't cheer. They were silent, cold, watching, judging. It was the point of no return. The monarchy had cracked, and now it was only a matter of time before it collapsed. By the time Marie Antoinette was thrown into the Temple prison in 1792, she was no longer a queen. Her husband had already been executed. Her children were taken from her. Her hair had turned white from stress, and now all that remained was the trial. The Temple prison, it wasn't built for royalty. It was a medieval fortress, dark, damp, and designed to break a person before the executioner ever touched them. After living in golden halls and silk-covered rooms, Marie Antoinette now found herself locked inside a cold and windowless cell. The floors were stone, the walls were wet with condensation, her straw mattress crawled with lice, and rats were her only visitors. She was never really left alone, though. Revolutionary guards watched her constantly, even while she slept, ate, or prayed. Every word was recorded, every sigh judged. Meals were meager, thin broth, stale bread, sometimes a little wine, nothing more. Her health began to fail. She grew weaker, thinner. Her gums bled, her legs swelled. Her hair, once powdered in style in Versailles, had turned white from so much stress. But worse than hunger, the cold, or the filth, was her isolation. Her children were ripped away from her, her husband already executed. Letters were censored, visitors were banned. She was only 37, but in the temple, she was treated like a symbol, not a human being, not a mother, not a widow, just the widow Capet, a name that stripped her of royalty, dignity, and identity. And yet, she remained composed. She wrote, she prayed, and she waited. Her trial began on October 14th, 1793, in a courtroom packed with revolutionaries, journalists, and the ghosts of guillotines yet to fall. Marie Antoinette was no longer addressed as the queen. She was a woman on trial for treason. The charges were sweeping: conspiring with Austria, draining the treasury, corrupting her son, and even orchestrating plots from her prison cell. Much of it was exaggerated, some of it entirely fabricated. One of the most devastating moments, when the revolutionaries presented a forced confession from her 8-year-old son Louis Charles, accusing her of abuse. Marie Antoinette said nothing for most of her trial, but when the court asked her to respond to her son's accusation, she finally spoke, not in defense, but as a mother. "I have not answered because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge made against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present." It was one of the only moments in the entire revolution when Marie Antoinette stirred sympathy. But it wasn't enough. On October 16th, at 4:30 in the morning, she was sentenced to death. Before dawn, Marie Antoinette wrote one final letter, not to her enemies, not to history, but to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, a last goodbye, a prayer, a piece of her soul. The letter was never delivered. It was confiscated by revolutionary officials, locked away like the woman who wrote it. Marie Antoinette would face the guillotine that same day, but she had already said her last words. Not to the crowd, not to history, but to her family and to the person she used to be. It was just past noon, October 16th, 1793. The former Queen of France stepped out into the cold light of a Paris autumn, wearing a simple white shift, her hair cut short to expose her neck. She wasn't allowed the dignity her husband had received. No covered carriage. Marie Antoinette was paraded through the streets of Paris in an open cart, her head bare, her posture straight, her eyes fixed ahead. The crowd had once screamed her name in adoration. Now, they just stared at her like a ghost. Some wept, others jeered, but most were silent, watching history die in real time. It took over an hour to reach the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine waited, the same spot where Louis XVI had died 9 months earlier. At the top of the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner. And guys, she immediately apologized. And those were her final words. Not to the crowd, not to France, but to a man that she would never meet again. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, daughter of an empress, wife of a king, mother of 2, was gone. She was only 37 years old. Marie Antoinette didn't survive the French Revolution, but the version of her that lived on in history, that version has a very different fate. She became a symbol of wealth, waste, and everything wrong with the monarchy, the villain in the revolution's morality play. But was that who she really was? First of all, she never said let them eat cake. That quote, it existed years before she even arrived in France, and it was likely aimed at another queen entirely. But the public, they were hungry, angry, and desperate. They were desperate for a villain. And Marie, she had the dresses, the diamonds, the accent, the foreign blood. Ultimately, she became a scapegoat, blamed for everything from food shortages to political betrayal. Most of the public had no idea what she was actually doing in Versailles. But in truth, she was a teenage girl dropped into a foreign country, married to a socially awkward boy, and used as a pawn in a political alliance she barely even understood. She was not innocent, but she was also not the monster history made her out to be. She spent too much, she failed to read the room, but she was also lonely, scrutinized, and deeply human. Her shopping sprees were like coping, her retreat to Petit Trianon, a way to escape court, not the public. Over the centuries, Marie Antoinette has been reimagined again and again as a vapid party girl, a tragic royal, a fashion icon, and even a misunderstood feminist symbol. But maybe the truth is somewhere in between. She was flawed, yeah, but she was also mistreated, misunderstood, and ultimately destroyed by forces far larger than herself. Marie Antoinette was never just a queen. She was a mirror, reflecting back the fears, fantasies, and fury of a changing world. And maybe it's time we finally saw her for what she truly was, a girl who became a symbol and paid for it with her life. So now that we've peeled back the layers of scandal and scrutiny that surrounded Marie Antoinette, the foreign queen accused of extravagance, aloofness, and the infamous let them eat cake, we need to dive into the person that every queen stands with, her king. And in this case, he's just as polarizing. Louis XVI, the last king of France before the Revolution, is often painted as weak, indecisive, and tragically out of touch. But was he really the bumbling monarch that history remembers? Or was he a reform-minded ruler crushed under the weight of centuries-old privilege in a storm he never saw coming? Now we're going to dive into the controversy surrounding Louis XVI, his rule, his failures, and the choices that sealed not only his fate, but the fate of a monarchy nearly 1,000 years old. Louis XVI wasn't exactly born to be king material. He was shy, awkward, and more interested in locksmithing than in politics. Seriously, he loved locks more than some people love bread. And considering how that whole bread shortage went down, maybe that was part of the problem. While France teetered on the edge of collapse, Louis was struggling to do what every 18th century monarch was expected to do: look powerful, raise taxes, and pretend the Enlightenment wasn't a thing. But spoiler, the Enlightenment was very much a thing. He tried to reform the tax system. The nobility, well, they said no merci. He called the Estates General. That backfired. And then came the Revolution, which is French for you're out of a job. Oh, and also your head. But was Louis really the villain of the story? Or just a clueless guy, born into a role he never asked for, caught in a political blunder that he couldn't escape? Maybe he wasn't a tyrant. Maybe he was just the wrong guy, at the wrong time. By the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, France's finances were a disaster. Like maxed out credit cards, no savings, and still throwing massive parties kind of disaster. Why? Well, let's count the reasons. 1, the 7 Years' War, which was expensive and not very victorious. 2, the American Revolution, which France won, but at the cost of helping the US gain independence while France got more into debt and absolutely no freedom fries. And 3, centuries of royal overspending, because apparently gold fountains and diamond shoe buckles were considered essentials. Enter Louis, who actually wanted to fix things. Credit's where credit's due. He brought in financial advisors, like Turgot and Necker, who looked at the books and immediately began screaming into the void. Turgot suggested cutting spending and taxing the nobility. The nobility responded with, "How dare you?" And just like that, boom, he was fired. Necker tried being more charming and less slash everything. But even he couldn't make taxing the rich fashionable, so he was also fired. Louis kept trying to plug the hole with loans. But spoiler alert, you can't solve a debt crisis by going deeper into debt. France eventually had more IOUs than actually coin. The economy stalled, bread prices soared, and the people? Let's just say they weren't in the mood for a big group hug. While the nobles were sipping wine from diamond goblets and arguing about who had more lace on their sleeves, the commoners, aka 98% of France, were getting absolutely wrecked by the financial crisis. These were people already living paycheck to paycheck, if they even had paychecks. Most were rural peasants or urban workers, and the cost of just surviving, well, it started skyrocketing. Bread, which was like 80% of their diet, suddenly cost more than a Netflix subscription. And no, they couldn't just cancel it. Bad harvest in the 1780s meant less grain, which meant less bread, which meant more very angry people. And trust me, hungry people, they don't stay calm. There's a reason the revolution started with, "Where's the food?" and ended with, "Off with their heads." Meanwhile, taxes kept piling up. The nobles and clergy, exempt. But the commoners, they paid taxes on everything: land, salt, income, even to use the Lord's oven. That's right, you couldn't bake your sad, overpriced bread without paying a heat fee. And because the government was too broke to actually help, there was no safety net. If your crops failed or your job disappeared, that was it. Game over. And the result? Well, starvation, desperation, and the growing realization that this whole divine right of kings thing wasn't really working out. So while Louis XVI was fiddling with locks and Marie Antoinette was being dragged for cake, she never actually mentioned the people were hungry, broke, or out of patience. And when enough people have nothing to lose, well, that's when things really start to burn. But to provide more context for the frustration of the commoners, in the 18th century France, bread wasn't just food, it was survival. For the average peasant or urban worker, bread made up about 70 to 80% of their daily diet. If you had bread, you could make it throughout the day. If you didn't, well, things got ugly and fast. To put it in modern times, imagine if your entire grocery budget and half your paycheck went to buying just one item. Now imagine that item doubles in price because of bad harvests and a government too broke to intervene. Suddenly, your whole budget's toast. Pun intended. For a poor family in 1780s France, the day began and ended with bread. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and maybe dessert if you had a few crumbs left. Meat, rare luxury. Vegetables, well, seasonal and unreliable. But bread was life. So when grain prices shot up due to bad weather, poor harvests, and economic mismanagement, the result wasn't just grumbling, it was starvation. In some areas, riots broke out over rumors of hoarding. Bakers got attacked. Grain carts, well, they were looted, and people actually stormed bakeries. And to make matters worse, there was a widespread belief, not totally unfounded, that the rich were manipulating the grain supply to keep prices high. So yeah, if you're wondering why people were mad enough to chop off royal heads, try living on stale crumbs while your king throws a masquerade ball. Bread wasn't just food. It was a symbol of the inequality, the suffering, and the complete disconnect between the monarchy and the people. And when the cost of bread rose, so did the temperature of the revolution. So was Louis XVI the cause of rising bread prices? Well, not exactly. He didn't sneak into a bakery at night and crank up all the price tags. The real answer is a mix of bad luck, bad timing, and some genuinely just bad leadership. The 1780s saw a series of miserable harvests, especially after the harsh winter of 1788 to 1789. Think Game of Thrones level winter. Crops froze, grain died, and supply, well, it just plummeted. So basic economics. Less grain equals more expensive grain equals no bread for the poor. France's population also ballooned to over 25 million. More mouths to feed, not enough grain to go around. Even a small shortage sent prices soaring. Most farming in France, it was still medieval. Small plots, inefficient tools, and no modern storage. So when weather hit, it hit hard. France was also deep in debt from wars and lavish spending. So when things went bad, the crown couldn't afford to import grain or subsidize food prices. Louis wanted to help, but helping cost money, and well, he was broke. So let's break it down. Was Louis to blame? Not directly. He didn't cause the bad weather or invent inflation. But here's the thing. He was the king. And when you wear the crown, you also wear the blame. Especially when you're indecisive. Fire every finance minister who tells you the hard truths. And live in a golden palace while people eat bark soup. So no, Louis didn't cause the bread crisis, but his inability to lead through it, that definitely helped turn hunger into anger, and anger into a revolution. But okay, credit where it's due. Louis XVI wasn't a total tyrant. He wanted to fix France's problems. He knew the kingdom was broke. The people were starving, and the system was cracked. But here's the issue. Wanting to fix things doesn't mean you actually know how. So, what exactly did he do? Well, first, tax the nobility. Revolutionary idea, right? Making rich people pay taxes? Well, he tried. And you know what? The nobility, they said, hard pass. Because for centuries, they'd had a VIP pass to tax exemption. They weren't about to give that up for some broke king without a conscience. 2, call in all the experts, and then fire them. First, there was Turgot. He wanted to cut royal spending and remove feudal privileges. Fired. Then Necker, the people's favorite because he pretended the budget looked fine. Fired. Then Calonne, who proposed actual reform and got laughed out of the room. Fired. It was like the French version of The Apprentice, but with powdered wigs, of course. 3, abolishing labor dues. Louis did abolish some feudal dues and tried to make life easier for peasants. So what was the problem? Well, it was too little too late. You can't just throw a few breadcrumbs at a starving mob and expect them to calm down, especially when they haven't had actual bread in days. And 4th, legal and judicial reforms. He wanted to make the legal system more fair, but France's court system was so tangled in corruption and privilege that touching it was like swatting at a wasp's nest. Everyone got angry. Nobles, judges, even the queen probably. Louis's reforms weren't bad ideas. They just needed one small thing to succeed. Support from literally anyone. But the nobles, well, they didn't want to lose power. The clergy, they didn't want to lose money. And the people didn't trust him because, well, he was still living in Versailles and eating 5-course meals while they were literally eating boiling tree bark. He meant well, but he was super indecisive. He was easily influenced, and he always backed down when things got tough. It was like he wanted to be an Enlightenment king, but also not upset anyone. Spoiler, that's not how revolutions are avoided. So by the late 1780s, Louis had run out of options and out of time. The system wouldn't bend, and the people wouldn't wait. So he did something no French king had done in over 170 years. He called the Estates General. With France out of money, bread riots popping off, and the nobility refusing to pay taxes, Louis XVI had one move left: call the Estates General. This hadn't happened since 1614, over 170 years ago. To put that into perspective, the last time it met, Shakespeare was still alive, and France still thought leeches were cutting-edge medicine. Okay, so now you're asking, what the heck is the Estates General? Well, I'm here to tell you. The first estate is the clergy, which made up about 1% of the population. The second, the nobility, about 1.5%. The third, everyone else, the peasants, the working class, the middle class, they made up 98% of France. Each estate got one vote. Yeah, you heard that right. One vote per estate, not per person, which meant the first and the second estates, who were basically best friends, could always outvote the third estate, 2-1, no matter what. The third estate showed up like, hey, maybe we could vote by head count, since we represent nearly the entire country. But the nobility and the clergy, they were like, no thanks. So the third estate said, fine, we'll make our own meeting with blackjack and liberty. They broke off and declared themselves the National Assembly, basically saying, we're the real government now. Louis didn't know whether to crack down or to cheer them on, so naturally, he did what he always did. Nothing. Immediately. Then came the tennis court oath. Not a fancy noble sport, but a bunch of Third Estate reps locked out of their meeting hall who swore in an indoor tennis court that they wouldn't leave until France had a constitution. What a power move. Louis finally kind of gave in and told the First and Second Estates to join the party. But it was too late. The National Assembly? They had momentum. The people? They had hope. And Louis? He was losing control of the narrative and the country. By July of 1789, things in France were like a loaf of weak, old, nasty, hard, unstable bread, and one good crack away from total collapse. The people were starving. The National Assembly was challenging royal authority, and rumors were flying faster than bread prices. The king, he was amassing troops around Paris. Maybe he shut down the revolution before it got started. So on July 14th, the people of Paris decided to do what any calm, rational crowd would do. They stormed a literal prison fortress. But why Bastille? Was it full of political prisoners? Well, not really. There were only 7 prisoners inside. One was a forager. One thought he was Julius Caesar. Okay, so was it heavily guarded? Yeah. But it was also a huge symbol of total tyranny. Well, what did the crowd actually want? Weapons. Specifically, gunpowder for the muskets that they had borrowed from the military. The Bastille had gunpowder, stone walls, and guards, but it didn't have anything else. Any chance of survival against thousands of angry, hungry Parisians with nothing left to lose. After hours of fighting, the governor of the Bastille surrendered, and he was promptly beheaded. The crowd paraded his head through the streets on a pike, because in 1789, subtlety was dead. That night, Louis wrote one word in his diary: rain, French for nothing. Nothing? Sir, the people just stormed a fortress, freed prisoners, and kicked off one of the most famous revolutions in human history. But sure, nothing. The storming of the Bastille wasn't just about a building. It was about breaking the idea that the king was untouchable. It was a message. We're not afraid anymore. And once fear is gone, so is the old regime's grip on power. After the Bastille fell, Louis XVI was faced with a choice: become a constitutional monarch and work with the people, or just keep pretending everything was fine and hope the mob, well, let's just hope they get tired. Guess which one he picked? Spoiler, it was the wrong one. The National Assembly was on fire. Not literally, well, not yet. Passing new laws, declaring human rights, and trying to build a better France. Louis? He dragged his feet. He hesitated to sign anything. Every time he said yes, it sounded a lot like, maybe, let's see if the nobles agree. It's like the country was screaming for change, and Louis, he was replying with a shrug and a croissant. Then came one of the most powerful moments in the revolution. Thousands of women, mostly market workers and mothers, marched from Paris to Versailles in the pouring rain, demanding bread, justice, and that the king came back to Paris immediately. And what do you know? He did. The royal family was basically kidnapped in their own golden carriage and brought to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where the revolution could keep an eye on them, like a very angry babysitter. But things got worse. So Louis did what any panicking monarch would do. He tried to run away. He and Marie Antoinette disguised themselves as regular folks and tried to flee to Austria. Shockingly, they were recognized because when you're the king of France, wearing a mustache doesn't make you unrecognizable. They were dragged back to Paris in shame. At that point, even his last supporters were like, yeah, we're done here. And just to add more gasoline to the fire, France decided it would be a great time to go to war with Austria, Marie Antoinette's homeland, and eventually, Prussia too. Louis secretly hoped France would lose, thinking foreign armies might restore him to power. In August of 1792, the people, they officially had enough. A mob stormed the royal palace, the National Assembly suspended the monarchy, and Louis was arrested. He was no longer King of France, just Citizen Louis Capet. Louis was put on trial for treason, and the evidence? Well, trying to flee, conspiring with enemies of the state, and generally being the human version of a shrug emoji while the country burned. He was found guilty, and on January 21st, 1793, he was executed by guillotine. His final act as king was losing his head over the entire situation. From absolute monarch to constitutional puppet to head in a basket, Louis XVI's spiral wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. And as the king fell, France descended into something even darker, the Reign of Terror. So the king is dead. Long live chaos. With Louis XVI executed and the monarchy abolished, you might think France could finally relax, throw on a beret, and enjoy some sweet liberty. Instead, things got darker. Leading the charge was Maximilien Robespierre, a man who loved liberty, justice, and public executions, but maybe not at the same time. Robespierre and his radical Jacobin allies believed France could only survive through virtue and terror. Yes, actual quote, terror is nothing more than prompt, severe, inflexible justice, which is a fancy way of saying heads will roll, a lot of them. So who's getting guillotined today? Nobles? Clergy? Moderates? Revolutionaries who weren't revolutionary enough? People who spelled Robespierre's name wrong? People who looked at him the wrong way? Basically, if you were breathing and not 100% Jacobin approved, you were on thin ice. Trials were short, sentences were brutal, and the guillotine became the most popular public attraction in Paris. France became a nation where saying the wrong thing, or nothing at all, could mean death. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Friends vanished overnight. If the revolution devoured the monarchy, now it was devouring itself. Robespierre kept raising the stakes, purging his rivals, tightening control, and preaching moral virtue, all while orchestrating mass executions. Eventually, even his allies started saying, "Hey, are you okay?" In July of 1794, the revolution turned on its own architect. Robespierre, he was arrested, tried, and guillotined without trial. The terror was over, but the damage was already done. By the end of the Reign of Terror, over 16,000 people had officially been executed. Many thousands more died in prison or in civil conflict, all in the name of liberty. The revolution had started with high ideals and it ended in blood. France would continue to change, but the dream of a peaceful national republic, that had been left on the scaffold. And just like that, Louis XVI, once the most powerful man in France, became a symbol of a dying era, swept away by a revolution that he couldn't stop, couldn't control, and maybe never really even understood. His story isn't just about one man losing his head. It's about a world turned upside down, where the people demanded change and got way more than they bargained for. If you made it this far, thank you for surviving the absolute roller coaster that was Louis XVI's downfall. The French Revolution is way bigger than one king losing his crown, or his head. So if you guys want to deep dive into the full revolution, from the tennis court oath, to Robespierre's guillotine spree, to Napoleon crashing the party like it's a military coup, let me know in the comments. Hit like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe for more history. And if you're still awake, I'll leave the fire burning a little bit longer for you, hoping the calm sounds of the burning embers help put you to sleep. Bye, guys.